Om Ajnana-timirandhasya Jnananjana-salakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Katamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Sri Yuta Padakamalan Shri Guru Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakha Anvitamscha Namam Vishnu Padaya Krishna Pristhaya Bhutale Shrimate Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Sunyavadi Paschatya Desatarine Vancha Kalpatarabhyascha Kripa Sindhubhyev cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Namo Mahavadanyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gauratvishe Namaha He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesa Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Rishabhanusute Devi Pranamami Haripriye Jaya Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Reading from Prabhupāda-līlāmṛta Volume 1 Chapter 21 Part 2. Brahmananda. We didn't start recording right away because there was a group ahead of us. So we went out for a walk in Times Square. We were just standing there with Swamiji, seeing all the flashing lights and all the sense gratification, when a woman came up to Swamiji and said, "Oh, hello, where do you come from?" in a very loud, matronly way. And Swamiji said, "I am a monk from India." And she said, "Oh, that's wonderful. Glad to meet you." And then she shook Swamiji's hand and left. At the studio, everyone accepted the devotees as a regular music group. One of the rock musicians asked them what the name of their group was, and Hayagriva laughed and replied, "The Hare Krishna chanters." Of course, most of the devotees weren't actually musicians, and yet the music instruments they brought with them a tambora, a large harmonium loaned by Allen Ginsberg, and rhythm instruments were once they had played during kirtans for months. So as they entered the studio, they felt confident that they could produce their own sound. They just followed their Swami. He knew how to play, and they knew how to follow him. They weren't just another music group. It was music, but it was also chanting, meditation, worship. Prabhupada sat on a mat in the center of the studio while the engineers arranged the microphone and assigned each devotee a place to sit according to his particular instrument. They asked for only two pairs of kartals and they approved of the pairs of rhythm sticks, but they wanted several devotees clapping their hands. Rupanuga's usual instrument was a pair of brass Indian bells with the tongues removed, and when the engineer saw them, he came over and said, "Let me hear that." Rupanuga played them and they passed. Since Ravinder Swarup would be playing the drone on the harmonium, he sat apart with his own microphone, and Kirtanananda also had a microphone for the tampora. When the engineers were satisfied, they cued the devotees, and Swamiji began chanting and playing his drum. The cymbals and sticks and clapping hands joined him, and the chanting went on steadily for about 10 minutes until an engineer came out of the glass studio and stopped them. Brahmananda was clapping too loudly, creating an imbalance. The engineer went back into his studio, put on his headphones, balanced everyone, and cued them for a second take. This time it was better. The first sound was the tampura with its plugged, reverberating twang. An instant later, Swamiji began beating the drum and singing. Vandeham Shri Guru. Then the whole ensemble put out to sea. The tambura, the harmonium, the clackers, the cymbals, Rupanaga's bells, Swamiji's solo singing, pushing off from their moorings out into a fair weather sea of chanting. Lalita Sri Vishaka Anvitamsha. Swamiji's voice in the studio was very sweet. His boys were feeling love, not just making a record. There was a feeling of success and union, a crowning evening to all their months together. Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda. After a few minutes of singing prayers alone, Swamiji paused briefly while the instruments continued pulsing and then began the mantra Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. It was pure Bhaktivedanta Swami, expert just like his cooking in the kitchen, like his lectures. The engineers liked what they heard. It would be a good take if nothing went wrong. The instruments were all right, the drums, the singing, the harmonium was rough, but this was a special record happening. The Hare Krishna chanters were doing their thing and they were doing it all right. Alan Kalman was excited. Here was an authentic sound, maybe it would sell. After a few rounds of the mantra, devotees began to feel relaxed as though they were back in the temple and they were able to forget about making mistakes on the record. They just chanted and the beat steadied into a slightly faster pace. The word Hare would come sometimes with a little sound in it, but there were no emotional theatrics in the chorus, just the straight response to the Swami's melody. 10 minutes went by. The chanting went faster, louder, and faster. Swamiji doing more fancy things on the drum until suddenly everything stopped with a droning note of harmonium lingering. Alan came out of the studio. It was great, Swami, great. Would you like to just go right ahead and read the address now? Oh, or are you too tired? With polite concern, pale, befreckled, Alan Culman peered through his thick glasses at the Swami. Swamiji appeared tired, but he replied, No, I am not tired. Then the devotees sat back in the studio to watch and listen as Prabhupada read his prepared statement. As explained on the cover of the record album, the sympathetic devotees thought that Swamiji, despite his accent, sounded perfectly clear, reading from his script like an elocutionist. This transcendental vibration by chanting of Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare is a sublime method for reviving our Krishna consciousness. The language was philosophical, and the kind of people who usually walked out of the temple as soon as the kirtan ended, before the Swami could even speak a word, would also not appreciate this speech on their record album. As living spiritual souls, Swamiji preached, we are all originally Krishna conscious entities. But due to our association with the matter from time immemorial, our consciousness is now polluted by material atmosphere. The devotees listened submissively to the words of their spiritual master, while at the same time trying to comprehend the effect this would have on the audience. Certainly, some people would turn it off at the very mention of a spiritual nature. Swamiji continued reading, explaining that the chanting would deliver one from the sensual and the mental and intellectual planes and bring one to the spiritual realm. We have seen it practically, he continued. Even a child can take part in the chanting, or even a dog can take part in it. The chanting should be heard, however, from the lips of a pure devotee of the Lord. And he continued reading on the end. No other means, therefore, of spiritual realization is as effective in this age as chanting the Maha Mantra. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Alan again came rushing out of the studio. It was fine, he said. He explained that they had recorded a little echo into the speech to make it special for the listeners. Now, he pushed back his glasses and with his finger, we have got about 10 minutes left on the side with the speech. Would you like to chant again? Or is it too late, Swamiji? Prabhupada smiled. No, it was not too late. He would chant the prayers to his spiritual master. While his disciples lounged around the studio, watching the spiritual master and the technical activity of the engineers behind the glass, Prabhupada began singing. Again, the harmonium's drone began, then the tambura and the drum, but with a much smaller rhythm group than before. He sang through without a retakes and then ended the song and the evening with a fortissimo drumming as the hand pumped organ notes faded. Again, Alan came out and thanked the Swami for being so patient and such a good studio musician. Prabhupada was still sitting. Now we are tired, he admitted. Suddenly, over the studio sound system came a playback of the Hare Krishna chanting, complete with echo. When Prabhupada heard the successful recording of his chanting, he became happy and stood and began dancing, swaying back and forth, dipping slightly from the waist, his arms upraised in the style of Lord Chaitanya dancing in ecstasy. The scheduled performance was over, but now Swamiji was making the best performance of the evening from his spontaneous feelings. As he danced, his half asleep disciples became startled and also arose to their feet and joined him dancing in the same style. And in the recording booth behind the glass, the engineers also raised their hands and began dancing and chanting. Now you have made your best record, Swamiji, told Mr. Kalman as he left the studio for freezing Manhattan evening. Swamiji got into the front seat of Volkswagen bus while the Hare Krishna chanters climbed into the back with their instruments and Rupanuga drove them back home, back to the lower east side. The next morning, the next morning, Prabhupada didn't get up. He was exhausted. Kirtanananda was personally serving him. Became alarmed when the Swamiji said something about his heart skipping and about not being able to move. For the first time, it became apparent that he was overexhausting himself. Kirtanananda thought back through the fall and summer when the Swami had led them and all on hours-long kirtans in the park or on late evening ventures. They had come to take it for granted, but now Kirtanananda saw that there was cause to be worried for Swamiji's health. Swamiji had no appetite for lunch, although by afternoon he regained his appetite and usual activity. That same day, a letter arrived from Mukunda in San Francisco. Now, not long after their wedding, Mukunda and Janaki had left for the west coast. Mukunda had told Swamiji that he wanted to go on to India to study Indian music, but after a few weeks in Southern Oregon, he had ended up in San Francisco. Now he had a better idea. He wanted to rent a place and invite Swamiji to come and start his Hare Krishna movement in the Haights Ashbury district just as he was doing on the Lower East Side. He said that the prospects there for Krishna consciousness were very good. On hearing this, Prabhupada began unfolding his expansive plans. They should open temples not only in San Francisco but one by one all over the world, even in Russia and China, and print the Bhagavad Gita in different languages. And he would translate all the volumes of Srimad Bhagavatam into English and take a party of devotees back to India. The devotees who heard him were amazed. Kirtanananda, who had seen the alarming symptoms of Prabhupada's ill health, began to forget what he had thought earlier that morning. If Krishna desired, Kirtanananda thought Swamiji could do anything. When Prabhupada came down to hold his morning class on November 19, he carried a large red book instead of usual brown one. But no one noticed the difference. He began, as always, softly singing praise to his spiritual master and accompanying himself with a faint rhythm on his bongo. The neighbors were still asleep. The weather was cold, but the steam radiators kept the storefront warm. There would be no more outdoor chanting now. In Manhattan, the city opens wide in the summer and shuts tight in the winter, which for the evening classes meant no more noisy children outside the door. And although the morning classes had always been quiet, even in the summer, now with winter approaching, the group became a tighter, more committed core of sincere students coming together to hear Swamiji speak. It was now 4 months since he had begun ISKCON at 26 Second Avenue. He had held three separate initiations and initiated 19 devotees. Most of them had become serious, although a few remained casual visitors. Now, in these morning classes, Swamiji wanted to instruct them more about how to become devotees. He led the chanting of the Hare Krishna for 20 minutes, cautioning them to respond softly so that neighbors would not pour water through the ceiling again, although they hadn't done it lately. Prabhupada always tried to cooperate with the tenants, but occasionally someone would start a petition, which never amounted to much against the devotees. Sometimes Prabhupada would help the landlord, Mr. Chatti, by taking out other tenants' garbage or just giving him a hand. Mr. Chatti was a husky, beer-bellied Polish refugee who lived alone in an apartment on the first floor. Mr. Chetty respected the Swami for his age and scholarship, and Swamiji was always amiable with him. Whenever Mr. Chetty came to the apartment, he would never take his shoes off, and Prabhupada would always say, "That's all right, that's all right." And one time, when the plumbing didn't work in Prabhupada's apartment, Prabhupada went downstairs and took a shower in Mr. Chetty's apartment. But Swamiji also considered Mr. Chatty a classic example of a foolish materialist because although he had spent his life's savings to buy this building, he still had to work so hard. Swamiji said he was a fool for having spent his savings to buy such a run-down building. Because the building was in such a poor condition, he had to work like an ass to keep it up. This is how the materialists work, Swamiji would say. Mr. Chetty, although respectful to the Swami, didn't like the devotees. Prabhupada told his disciples, "Treat him as if he were your father." So that's what they did. Anytime they would have to deal with Mr. Chetty, they would approach him saying, "We are your sons." Those disciples who lived at the storefront had risen by 6:30, bathed and assembled downstairs by 7, while those who lived outside were arriving separately, taking off their coats and piling them on the shelf of the display window. Although women always attended the evening meetings, Yadurani was usually the only girl who came in the morning. After breakfast, she would begin painting upstairs in the Swami's front room. She used a beginner's technique of dividing the canvas into vertical and horizontal grid lines and transposing bit by bit the corresponding sections of a photograph onto the canvas. The process was painstaking and sometimes her painting was out of proportion. But Yadurani was sincere and that pleased Prabhupada. She had completed several paintings of four-armed Vishnu, a new painting of Radha Krishna, and a painting of Lord Chaitanya and his associates. When the painting of Lord Chaitanya was finished, Swamiji had it hung in the temple. Now, he announced, there should be no more nonsense here. Lord Chaitanya is present. After the morning Kirtan Swami, After the morning Kirtan, Swami said as usual, "Now chant one round." They chanted together, following him. They all had a vow to chant 16 rounds daily, but they chanted their first round in the morning in the Swami's presence, so he could see each of them. As Swamiji chanted, he looked out at Second Avenue, which was mostly deserted, or at the picture on the wall, or with concerned glances at the individual devotees. Sometimes he seemed surprised when he saw them chanting so earnestly, giving evidence of the power of the holy name to deliver even the most fallen. Some of the devotees kept their beads in a bead bag like his, but when they chanted the first round together in the morning, they imitated him by holding their beads out in both hands and chanting along with him, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, until they finished the one round. Then he held up the unfamiliar red book. Because you are little advanced, he said, I am going to read today from the Chaitanya Charitamrita. Chaitanya what? No one was able to pick up the pronunciation. They had heard of Chaitanya, certainly, but not of this new book. But in his room the night before, Prabhupada had informed some of the devotees that he would start reading from a new book, Chaitanya Charitamrita. He said that Lord Chaitanya had told one of his disciples that understanding Krishna wasn't really possible, but that he would give the disciple just a drop of the ocean of Krishna consciousness, so that the disciple could then appreciate what the whole ocean must be like. Be patient as I present this, he had told them. It is revolutionary, but you should just be patient. In the storefront, Brahmananda turned on the reel-to-reel tape recorder as Swamiji began reading the Bengali verses, and both Satsvarupa and Umapati opened their notebooks and waited, paused, poised for rapid note-taking. It was almost a college classroom atmosphere as Prabhupada cleared his throat, put on his eyeglasses, and peered over the large open volume, turning to the correct page. Whenever he wore the glasses, he seemed to reveal a new personality of deep Vaishnava scholarship. This feature of Swamiji emphasized his old age. Not that it showed his feeble or invalid, but it emphasized his scholarship and wisdom, his contemplation of the scriptures, in contrast to his vigorous drum playing in Tompkins Square Park or his alert business dealings while looking for a new building. Swamiji began reading and translating the story of Sanatan. Satsvarupa wrote Sutta, and Umapati wrote Sunotan, and his brother Rupa, and how they became intimate associates of Lord Chaitanya. It was a historical account. Rupa and Sanatan had been born as Brahmanas in India, but they had served in government under the Muslims who were in power at that time. The two brothers had even adopted Muslim names, but when Lord Chaitanya was touring in their parts of the country, they had met him and had become determined to give up their materialistic ways and follow his path of pure love of God. Rupa, who was so rich that he had enough gold to fill two boats, left his high government post, divided his wealth, became a mendicant, and joined Lord Chaitanya. For Sanatan, however, there were more obstacles. The Nawab Shah, the chief Muslim ruler of province of Bengal, was dependent on Sanatan's managerial expertise. But Sanatan began staying home and submitting sick reports, while actually he had employed a dozen Brahmanas who were teaching, who were teaching him the Srimad Bhagavatam. Oh. The Nawab sent his physician to find out the actual state of Sanatan's health, and when Nawab heard that Sanatan was not actually ill, he himself arrived one day, surprising Sanatan and the Brahmanas. The Nawab demanded that Sanatan return to his government work and leave his free to do some hunting and to leave Bengal on a military campaign. But Sanatan said that he could not, that he was now determined to study the scriptures and that Nawab could do with him whatever he liked. At this challenge, Nawab imprisoned Sanatan. Swamiji looked at his watch. Morning classes were shorter than those in the evening, only half an hour, and Rupanuga, Satsvarupa, and Brahmananda had to go to work. He paused in his narration. So we will discuss tomorrow. Prabhupada closed the book, and after a few informal words, he got up and left the storefront, followed by Kirtanananda, who carried his book and glasses. Breakfast was served every morning in the storefront. Either Achyutananda or Kirtanananda would cook an oatmeal cereal for the devotees. Satsvarupa had read in an English edition of the Ramayana about some sages preparing a mystical cereal called heavenly porridge. The name had caught on, and the devotees began calling their own cereal heavenly porridge. The popular fare would consist of steaming hot heavenly porridge, sweetened to taste with sugar syrup from the gulab jamun pot, hot milk and fruit, and each devotee would get an ISKCON bullet. At breakfast this morning, the talk was of Rupa and Sanatan. Umapati said the Chaitanya Charitamrita was available in an English translation, but maybe the Swami wouldn't want them to read it. We are hear it from Swamiji, Kirtanananda said. Hayagriva was amused at the cliffhanger ending of the class. Tune in tomorrow. He laughed uh, loosely and here what happened to what's his name? The devotee responded differently. Santan, Sunoton, Sanatan, Hayagriva, yeah, tune in tomorrow and hear. Will Sanatan get out of jail? They were not the most sober group when together, especially after taking the thick sweet syrup. Achyutananda spilled some of the syrup on the rug and Kirtananda admonished him. Yadurani ate silently and hurried to begin a day's painting in Prabhupada's room. Satsvarupa adjusted his tie and he and Rupanuga and Brahmananda went to their jobs. The next morning, the Chaitanya Charitamrita seminar began with Sanatan in jail, planning how to get free to join Lord Chaitanya. His brother Rupa sent him a note saying that he had left a large sum of gold for Sanatan in the care of a grocer, and Sanatan offered the gold to jailer as a bribe. He told him, "Sir, I know you are very learned man, and in your Quran it says that if you aid someone in going to spiritual life, then you will be elevated to highest position. I am going to Lord Chaitanya, and if you will assist me in escaping, it will be spiritual gain for you. Also, I will give you 500 gold coins, so it will be material gain as well." The jailkeeper said, "All right, but I am afraid of the king." So Sanatan advised him, "Just say that when I was passing stool by the river, I fell in with my chains and was washed away." For 700 gold coins, the jailer agreed to help Sanatan and sawed off the shackles. Sanatan, accompanied by his servant, then fled by the back roads until by night time he came upon a hotel. Now this hotel was kept by thieves, and an astrologer at the hotel read Sanatan's palm and judged by the stars that he had money. When Sanatan asked for assistance in passing over the jungle mountains, the hotel keeper said that he would help Sanatan leave in the dead of the night. They treated Sanatan with great respect, which made him suspicious, since he hadn't eaten in 3 days and his clothes were unclean. So he asked his servant if he had any money. The servant said yes, he had 7 gold coins. And Sanatan immediately took the money to the hotel keeper, who was already planning to kill him during the night and take his money. Swamiji looked at his watch. Again, they had gone over time. "So we will continue tomorrow," he said, closing the book. How Sanatan manages to escape the dacoits. Kirtanananda, Brahmananda, Achyutananda, Gargamuni, Satswarupa, Hayagriva, Umapati, Yadurani, Rupanuga, Damodar, and Clark, their lives had all been transformed. Over the months, they had transferred the center of their lives to Swamiji, and everything revolved around the routine of classes and Kirtan and Prasadam and coming and going to and from the storefront. Brahmananda and Gargamuni had given up their apartment several months ago and moved into the storefront. The ceiling of Achyutananda's apartment had caved in one day, just minutes after he had left the room, and he had decided to move to storefront also. Hayagriva and Umapati had cleaned up their Mott Street place and were using it only for chanting, sleeping, or reading Swamiji's Bhagavatam. Satswarup had announced one day that the devotees could use his apartment just around the corner from the temple for taking showers, and the next day Raya Ram had moved in, and the others began using the apartment as a temple annexure. Yadurani kept making her early morning treks from the Bronx. Swamiji had said that he had no objection to her living in the second room of his apartment, but that people would talk. Even Rupanuga and Damodar, whose backgrounds and tastes were different, were also positively dependent on the daily morning class and the evening class 3 nights a week, and in knowing that Swamiji was always there in his apartment whenever they needed him. There were, however, some threats to this security. Prabhupada would sometimes say that unless he got permanent residence from the government, he would have to leave the country. But he had gone to a lawyer, and after the initial alarm, it seemed that Swamiji would stay indefinitely. There was also the threat that he might go to San Francisco. He said he was going, but then sometimes he said he wasn't. If the negotiations to Mr. Price for the building on the 10th Street came through, then Swamiji said he would make his headquarters in New York City and not go to San Francisco. But at least in the morning sessions, as his disciples listened to him speaking on Chaitanya Charitamrita, these threats were all put out of mind, and the timeless, intimate teachings took up their full attention. Krishna consciousness was a struggle, keeping yourself strictly following Swamiji's code against Maya. No illicit sex, no intoxication, no gambling, no meat eating. But it was possible as long as they could hear him singing and reading and speaking from Chaitanya Charitamrita. They counted on his presence for their Krishna consciousness. He was the center of their newly spiritualized lives, and he was all they knew of Krishna consciousness. As long as they could keep coming and seeing him. Krishna consciousness was a sure thing as long as he was there. Seated on the worn rug, they looked up at him, waiting for him to begin the next installment. Prabhupada cleared his throat and glanced down at Brahmananda, who sat beside the silently running tape recorder. Satswarup entered the date in his notebook. Prabhupada began reading the Bengali verses and paraphrasing. Sanatan took the 7 gold coins from his servant and gave them to the hotel keeper. You have 8 coins, the astrologer said, and Sanatan went back and found that his servant was retaining another gold coin. Why do you carry this death knell on the road? Sanatan asked. You are too attached to money. And he took the gold piece from his servant and told him to return home. Sanatan then brought the gold coin to the hotel keeper. But the hotel keeper, who admitted that he had intended to kill Sanatan for his money, now said, You are a good man, and you may keep your money. But Sanatan refused. Then the hotel keeper provided Sanatan with 4 assistants. They helped Sanatan through the jungle and then left him alone. Free from this nuisance servant and from the dacoits, Sanatan felt liberated as he passed along the road alone. Soon he came up his brother-in-law who was traveling along the same road. His brother-in-law was a wealthy man carrying a great deal of money to buy horses. Please stay with me at least a few days, Sanatan brother-in-law said. It's really bad how you look. The brother-in-law knew that Sanatan was going to spiritual path, but he requested that he improve his dress by accepting a valuable blanket from him. Sanatan took the blanket and continued on his way. At last, Sanatan reached Benares and he went straight to the home of Chandrasekhar, where Lord Chaitanya was staying, and waiting outside the door. Lord Chaitanya knew Sanatan had arrived and he requested Chandrasekhar to go to the door and ask the devotee who was waiting there to come in. Chandrasekhar went out but saw only the wretched-looking Sanatan, whom he took to be a half-mad Mohammedan fakir. Chandrasekhar returned to Lord Chaitanya and explained that there was no devotee outside. Was there anyone at all? The Lord asked. Yes, said Chandrasekhar, some wretched fakir. Then Lord Chaitanya went to the door and embraced Sanatan. The Lord cried tears of ecstasy, for he had at last found a devotee whom he knew was worthy to receive his entire teachings. And Sanatan cried tears of joy that his life's ambition was being fulfilled. But because he was dirty from his traveling and now not worthy, he asked the Lord not to touch him. The Lord replied, It is I who benefit from touching you. Whoever touches a true devotee is blessed. Prabhupada closed the book, ending another morning session. One of Prabhupada's main concerns was to finish and publish as soon as possible his translation and commentary of Bhagavad Gita. And one day something happened that enabled him to increase his work on the manuscript. Unexpectedly, a boy named Neil arrived. He was a student from Antioch College on a special work-study program, and he had the school's approval to work 1 term within the ashram of Swami Bhaktivedanta, which he had heard about through the newspapers. Neil mentioned that he was a good typist, if that could be of any help to Swami. Prabhupada considered this to be Krishna's blessing. Immediately, he rented a dictaphone and began dictating tapes. Haigriva donated his electric typewriter, and Neil set up his work area in Swami's front room and began typing 8 hours a day. This inspired Prabhupada and obliged him to produce more. He worked quickly, sometimes day and night, on his Bhagavad Gita as it is. He had founded ISKCON 5 months ago, yet in his classes he was still reading the Bhagavad Gita translation of Dr. Radhakrishnan. But when Bhagavad Gita as it is would at last be published, he told his disciples it would be of major importance for the Krishna consciousness movement. At last there would be a bona fide edition of the Gita. Whatever Swamiji said or did, his disciples wanted to hear about it. Gradually, they had increased their faith and devotion to Swamiji, whom they accepted as God's representative, and they took his actions and words to be absolute. After one of the disciples had been alone with him, the devotees would rather would gather around to find out every detail of what had happened. It was Krishna consciousness. Yadurani was especially guileless in relating what Swamiji had said or done. One day, Prabhupada had stepped on a tack that Yadurani had dropped on the floor, and although she knew it was a serious offense to her spiritual master, the major importance of the event seemed to be how Prabhupada had displayed his transcendental consciousness. He silently and emotionlessly reached down and pulled the tack from his foot without so much as a cry. And once, when she was fixing a painting over his head behind the desk, she had accidentally stepped on his sitting mat. Is that an offense? She had asked, and Swamiji replied, No, for service you could even stand on my head. Sometimes Brahmananda would say that Swamiji had told him something very intimate about Krishna consciousness in private. But when he would tell what Swamiji had said, someone else would recall that the same thing was in Srimad Bhagavatam. Prabhupada had said that the spiritual master is present in his instructions and that he had tried to put everything into those 3 volumes of the Bhagavatam, and the devotees were finding this to be true. There was no secrets in Swamiji's family of devotees. Everyone knew that Umapati had left for a few days disappointed with Swamiji's severe criticism of the Buddhists, but had come back, and in a heavy, sincere exchange with Swamiji, he had decided to take to Krishna consciousness again. And everyone knew that Satsvarupa had resigned from his job, and that when he went to tell Swamiji about it, Swamiji had told him that he could not quit but should go on earning money for Krishna and donating it to the society, and this would be his best service. And everyone knew that Swamiji wanted Gargamuni to cut his hair. Swamiji called it Gargamuni's Shakespearean locks, but that he would not do so. The year ended, and Prabhupada was sitting working on his manuscript of Bhagavad Gita, still lecturing in the mornings from Chaitanya Charitamrita, and Mondays, Wednesdays, and Friday evenings from Bhagavad Gita, and still talking of going to San Francisco. Then New Year's Eve came, and the devotees suggested that since this was a holiday when people go out to celebrate, maybe they should hold a Krishna conscious festival, Rupanuga. So we had a big feast, and a lot of people came, although it wasn't as crowded as the Sunday feast. We were all taking prasadam, and Swamiji was sitting up on his dais, and he was also taking prasadam. He was demanding that we eat lots of prasadam, and then he was saying chant, chant. So we were eating and chanting Hare Krishna between bites, and he was insisting on more and more prasadam. I was amazed. He stayed with us and kept insisting that we eat so much. He stayed until around 11 o'clock, and then he became drowsy and the party was over. Morning after morning, the story of Sanatan Goswami unfolded from the pages of Swamiji's big book, which only he could read and explain. Lord Chaitanya told Sanatan that he should be very grateful that Krishna had been merciful to him. To which Sanatan replied, You say that Krishna is very merciful, but I do not know who Krishna is. You have saved me. Lord Chaitanya had many devotees in Banaras, and he sent Sanatan to the home of one of his friends where he could get something to eat, take a bath, shave, and dress in a new clothing. Sanatan, however, refused the new clothing, and he also refused to become dependent on one place for his meal. Now that he had entered the renounced order, he preferred to go begging his meals at a different places each day. When Lord Chaitanya saw all this, he was pleased, but Sanatan sensed that his valuable blanket did not please the Lord, so he traded the new blanket for an old one. This pleased Lord Chaitanya, who said, Now you are completely renounced. Your last attachment is gone by the mercy of Krishna. Sanatan submitted himself at the lotus feet of Lord Chaitanya and said, I have wasted my time in sense gratification. I am low born. I have low association. I have no qualification for spiritual life. I do not even know what is actually beneficial for me. People say that I am learned, but I am fool number one, because although people say I am learned and although I accept it, still I do not know who am I. Sanatan presented himself as a blank slate, and he inquired from the Lord, "Who am I? Why am I in this material world? Why am I suffering?" Prabhupada emphasized that this was the perfect way for a disciple to accept a spiritual master. After narrating the story of Sanatan's joining Lord Chaitanya, Prabhupada began lecturing on the Lord's teachings to Sanatan. Lord Chaitanya first explained that the living being is not the material body but an eternal living soul within the body. Then, for 2 months, Lord Chaitanya instructed Sanatan, revealing to him the deepest and most sublime philosophical truths of Vedic wisdom. He enlightened Sanatan regarding the soul and its relationship with Krishna, the nature of the material and spiritual worlds, the characteristics of a fully realized soul, and the transcendental nature of Lord Krishna and his unlimited forms, expansions, incarnations, and divine pastime. He explained the superiority of the path of bhakti yoga over the paths of philosophical speculation and yogic mysticism, and he revealed to Sanatan the esoteric knowledge of spiritual ecstasy experienced by those souls who have achieved pure love for Krishna. These teachings of the Lord were like an ocean that overflooded the mind of Sanatan Goswami with its sweetness and grandeur. When Lord Chaitanya had finished instructing Sanatan, he gave Sanatan the benediction that all those sublime teachings would be fully manifested within his heart, thus enabling him to compose transcendental literature. For 2 months, Lord Chaitanya had instructed Sanatan Goswami, and for 2 months, starting in mid November of 1966, Srila Prabhupada narrated in over 50 lectures the Chaitanya Charitamrita's account of those teachings. Although each of his talks covered the subject matter of the verses, his lectures were never limited to his subject, nor were they prepared talks. Sometimes during the evening gatherings in his room, Swamiji would ask whether Mukunda was ready on the west coast. For months, Prabhupada's going to the west coast had been one of a number of alternatives. But then, during the first week of New Year, a letter arrived from Mukunda. He had rented a storefront in the heart of Haight Ashbury district on Frederick Street. "We are busy converting it into a temple now," he wrote, and Prabhupada announced, "I shall go immediately." Mukunda had told of a gathering of tribes in San Francisco's Haight Ashbury. Thousands of hippies were migrating from all over the country to the very neighborhood where Mukunda had rented the storefront. It was a youth renaissance much bigger than what was going on in the New York City. In a scheme to raise funds for the new temple, Mukunda was planning a mantra rock dance, and famous rock bands were going to appear, and Swami Bhaktivedanta and the chanting of the Hare Krishna were to be center of attraction. Although his letter, Although in his letter Mukunda had enclosed a plain ticket, some of the Swami's followers refused to accept that Swamiji would use it. Those who knew they could not leave New York began to criticize the idea of Swamiji going to San Francisco. They didn't think that people out on the West Coast mm, could take care of Swamiji properly. Swamiji appearing with rock musician, those people out there didn't seem to have the proper respect. Anyway, there was no suitable temple there. There was no printing press, no Back to Godhead magazine. Why should Swamiji leave New York to attend a function like that with the strangers in California? How could he leave them behind in New York? How could their spiritual life continue without him? Timidly, one or two dissenters indirectly expressed some of their feelings to Prabhupada, as if almost wishing to admonish him for thinking of leaving them, and even hinting that things would not go well either in San Francisco or New York if he departed. But they found Prabhupada quite confident and determined. He did not belong to New York. He belonged to Krishna and he had to go wherever Krishna desired him to preach. Prabhupada showed a spirit of complete detachment, eager to travel and expand the chanting of Hare Krishna. Brahmananda. But we were shocked that he was going to leave. I never thought that Krishna consciousness would go beyond the lower east side, what to speak of New York City. I thought that this was it, and it would stay here eternally. In the last days of second week of January, final plane reservations were made, and the devotees began packing Swamiji's manuscripts away in in trunks. Ranchor, a new devotee recruited from Tompkins Square Park, had collected enough money for a plane ticket, and the devotees decided that he should accompany Prabhupada as his personal assistant. Prabhupada explained that he would only be gone for a few weeks, and that he wanted all the programs to go on in his absence. He waited in his room while the boys arranged for a car to take him to the airport. The day was grey and cold, and the steam hissed in the radiators. He would take only a suitcase, mostly clothes and some books. He checked the closet to see that his manuscripts were in order. Kirtanananda would take care of his things in his apartment. He sat down at his desk where, for more than 6 months, he had sat so many times, working for hours at the typewriter, preparing his Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam, and where he had sat talking to so many guests and to his followers. But today he would not be talking with his friends or typing a manuscript, but waiting a last few minutes alone before his departure. This was his second winter in New York. He had launched a movement of Krishna consciousness. A few sincere boys and girls had joined. They were already well known on the Lower East Side. Many notices in the newspaper, and it was only the beginning. He had left Vrindavan for this. At first, he had not been certain whether he would stay in America more than 2 months. In Butler, he had presented his books, but then in New York, he had seen how Dr. Mishra had developed things, and the Mayavadis had a big building. They were taking money and not even delivering the real message of Gita, but the American people were looking. It had been a difficult year. His god brothers hadn't been interested in helping, although this is what their Guru Maharaj Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur wanted, and what Lord Chaitanya wanted. Because Lord Chaitanya wanted it, his blessings would come and it would happen. This was a nice place, 26 Second Avenue. He had started here. The boys would keep it up. Some of them were donating their salaries. It was a start. Prabhupada looked at his watch. He put on his sweet winter coat and his hat and shoes, put his right hand in his bead bag, and continued chanting. He walked out of the apartment, down the stairs, and through the courtyard, which was now frozen and still, its trees starkly bare without a single leaf remaining, and he left the storefront behind. He left even while Brahmananda, Rupanuga, and Sanatan were their office jobs. There was not even a farewell scene or a farewell address. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Thank you, Prabhuji.
Hare Krishna. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for joining. It was once again very nice to read the Katha. Yeah.
Thanks, Prabhuji.
Yeah, thank you for